He didn't believe in love, especially not with a woman 11 years older, until one morning, her voice stopped him in his tracks and changed everything. Ethan West had never believed in fate. His world was measured in analytics, precision, schedules down to the minute. As CEO of one of the fastest-growing media conglomerates in New York, he controlled every aspect of his day, and nothing happened by accident. At 35, he was admired, feared, and relentlessly focused. But on that particular morning, everything unraveled just enough for something unusual to slip through. His driver called in sick for the first time in 3 years. His espresso machine short-circuited. The backup car had a flat tire. So instead of racing through the day with his usual command, Ethan found himself walking 2 blocks through Lower Manhattan with a black coffee from a corner cart in his hand and irritation simmering just beneath the surface. He had no intention of stopping. No intention of looking up from the emails he was half reading on his phone. But then he heard something, a voice that didn't belong in the morning chaos of honking taxis and hurried shoes. It was clear and steady, rising like something rehearsed but deeply human. He looked up, and that's when he saw her. She was standing on the steps of an old theater, reading aloud from a worn paperback. Her voice didn't tremble. It filled the space with effortless grace. She wasn't young in the way most of the women in his circle were. Her hair, tied back loosely, revealed strands of soft silver. Fine lines traced the corners of her eyes and mouth, but nothing about her looked tired. She wore a long camel-colored coat, simple flats, and no noticeable jewelry. Elegant but unassuming. Ethan slowed down without realizing it. He wasn't a man who watched street performers, and she wasn't performing. She was simply existing, brilliantly, intentionally, in a space most people hurried past. He stood there, holding a now-cooling coffee, completely still. It wasn't attraction in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something harder to name. A pull. A shift. A feeling that someone had just altered the gravity of the street around him. She finished the passage and closed the book. A few people clapped softly and walked on. She offered a quiet smile, tucked the book into her bag, and turned to go. And that should have been the end of it. A passing moment, strange and poetic, easily dismissed by the logic-driven man Ethan had always been. But as she stepped down from the stairs and moved past him, she glanced up, just for a second, and met his eyes. There was no flicker of recognition, no flirtation. Just a calm, knowing gaze that seemed to see right through his $1,000 coat and the weight of his title. Then she walked on. Ethan didn't move for a full minute. Something in his chest was tight, like he'd just missed something important and didn't know how to get it back. He checked his phone out of habit, but the emails looked different now, smaller somehow, less urgent. He took another sip of the lukewarm coffee, stared at the spot where she had stood, and wondered who she was and why. For the first time in years, he suddenly couldn't think clearly. Ethan didn't mention her to anyone. Not to his assistant, not to Jason, his closest business partner, and certainly not to himself, not in the way that would have made it real. He told himself it had just been a passing curiosity, the kind that sometimes hits you after a night with too little sleep and too much caffeine. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The softness of her voice, the confidence in her stance, the way her presence made everything else around her feel less chaotic. It annoyed him. He had more important things to focus on, an upcoming acquisition, an internal rebranding strategy, several interviews scheduled for the following week. And yet, her image drifted through his thoughts like a quiet thread, weaving itself into the background of everything he did. 2 days later, Ethan was invited to sit in on a private leadership seminar at a local university, a favor to one of the board members who wanted to showcase the institution's corporate communication program. He wasn't excited about it, but he respected the contact and agreed to attend, knowing it would only take an hour of his time. The event was held in a clean, modern lecture hall, with business students and young professionals sitting in rows, eager to impress. Ethan took his seat in the front row, nodding to the dean, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt with practiced ease. He barely glanced at the printed schedule on the table in front of him. When the speaker was introduced, Ethan looked up. There she was. She walked onto the stage with a stack of notes, not glancing at the audience as she arranged her materials. She wore black slacks and a soft blue blouse, simple earrings that caught the light but never begged for attention. Her hair was loosely pinned back again, strands falling softly at her jaw. And when she finally lifted her head and looked out at the room, it happened again, that stillness, that quiet authority. "Good afternoon," she began. "My name is Grace Whitmore. I teach voice, presence, and the art of public communication. But what I really teach is how to be fully heard without ever raising your voice." Ethan forgot to breathe for a second. She didn't recognize him. Not from the cafe, not from that quiet morning on the sidewalk. Or if she did, she gave no indication. She moved through the opening of her presentation with practiced flow and easy composure. Her voice filled the room, not with force, but with clarity and intention. She wasn't theatrical, wasn't trying to impress. She was simply real, something Ethan hadn't realized he'd been craving until that moment. She talked about authenticity. About how people in power often lose their natural rhythm in the chase to sound impressive. She used examples, some funny, some profound. The room was captivated. Ethan, who had trained himself to tune out anything unrelated to immediate business goals, was completely focused. Not on her words alone, but on her. On how she stood. On the way she used silence as punctuation. On how every movement was purposeful but never performed. This wasn't showmanship. This was lived-in confidence. After the session, the room clapped enthusiastically. Students swarmed her with questions and thanks. Ethan stayed in his seat for a moment, unsure why he felt like a schoolboy again. When the crowd began to thin, he finally stood and approached her. Up close, she looked exactly as she had the first time, elegant, composed, and fully grounded in herself. Her eyes met his when he said, "You're very good at what you do." She smiled, the same quiet smile from that morning. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say." "I'm Ethan," he said. "Ethan West." He wasn't used to introducing himself. Usually, people already knew. She didn't flinch. Didn't raise her eyebrows. Just nodded. "Grace Whitmore." He didn't say anything for a moment, and she seemed perfectly content with the silence. Then he asked, "Would you mind if I walked you out?" She looked at him, not past him, not through him, but directly. She considered the offer. Then nodded once. "Sure." They walked slowly down the hall, their footsteps soft against polished floors, the air between them charged with something neither of them could quite name. She didn't ask what he did. She didn't compliment his suit. She didn't treat him like someone impressive. And that was exactly what made him want to know more. Ethan wasn't sure what he was doing. That wasn't a sentence he ever said out loud, but it echoed in his mind more than once after that afternoon with Grace. He told himself it was just curiosity, professional interest in a woman who clearly knew how to command a room without playing into ego or theatrics. But when he looked at his calendar and realized he had rearranged an entire week to keep a sliver of time free every afternoon, just in case, he knew it was more than that. He wasn't chasing her, exactly. He didn't know how to chase anyone. But he was lingering, hovering on the edge of something unfamiliar, and for once in his life, he didn't hate the feeling. Grace, on the other hand, remained composed, even distant at times. She never flirted. Never reached out. Never gave more than what the moment called for. But she never pushed him away either. When he showed up for another seminar, this one open to the public, she acknowledged him with a glance and a nod. Not a smile. Not a signal. Just recognition. and somehow that felt more powerful than any invitation. Afterward, he asked her if she wanted to grab a coffee. She hesitated, and for a brief second, he saw something flicker in her eyes, wariness, maybe, or memory. But then she agreed. They walked together to a small cafe tucked behind a bookstore, not the kind of place Ethan would have ever chosen himself. He let her lead, and when they sat across from each other at a quiet table near the window, something in the pace of the world slowed down. She ordered tea. He stuck with coffee. They talked, but not like two people trying to impress one another. She asked him how he ended up in media, and he told her about his obsession with stories as a child, how he never wanted to be in them, only to control how they were told. She asked if he still felt that way. He paused, then admitted he wasn't sure anymore. She shared that she had been a stage actress once, years ago, and that losing her voice, not physically, but metaphorically, after her divorce was the most disorienting thing she'd ever experienced. He asked if that's why she taught now. She said no. She taught because she wanted others to find their voice before it was taken from them. There was something about the way she said that made Ethan feel like he had spent his entire adult life not speaking at all, at least not with any truth. She didn't look at him like a headline or a figure of power. She looked at him like a man who might be worth seeing past the surface. It unsettled him more than any business competitor ever had. They met for coffee again. Then again. Each time was simple, short, never planned too far in advance. Grace never lingered. She left when it was time. She kept boundaries like a fortress. And Ethan, who had always taken what he wanted and walked away clean, found himself wanting something he didn't even know how to name. It wasn't lust. It wasn't novelty. It was something slower, more dangerous. He wanted to be known by her. And he had no idea how to make that happen. Jason noticed the shift before Ethan said a word. He cornered him one evening after a meeting and asked, "You seeing someone?" Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't deny it. Jason grinned. "It's the first time in 5 years you've been distracted. Kind of refreshing." Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't sure if it was distraction or awakening. All he knew was that Grace had taken up quiet space in his mind that he didn't want to clear. Late one night, he reread a contract 3 times and realized he hadn't absorbed a single word. He closed the laptop and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. He had built an empire on discipline, structure, and precision. But Grace made him feel like those things might not be enough anymore. Like something was missing that couldn't be measured or strategized. And the terrifying part was that he didn't want to run from it. He wanted more of it. Even if he didn't understand what it meant yet. It was early evening when Ethan asked her to dinner. Not coffee, not a seminar follow-up, not a casual walk after one of her workshops, an actual dinner. The words came out more nervously than he intended, and he hated that he felt like a schoolboy. But Grace, true to her nature, didn't overreact. She simply looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something invisible in the space between them. Then she nodded and said, "All right. One dinner." He chose a quiet French restaurant in the West Village, elegant but not pretentious, with low lighting and soft music. She arrived precisely on time, wearing a simple black dress and no jewelry except for a silver ring on her right hand. She looked timeless, not in a curated way, but in the way a person does when they've stopped trying to impress and instead just live fully in their skin. Ethan stood when she walked in, something he almost never did for anyone anymore. He wasn't trying to perform, it just felt like the right thing to do. Dinner began politely. They talked about books, music, the strange mood of the city in late autumn. He asked her what she missed most about acting. She said, "The moment before the lights go up. When anything is still possible." He smiled at that, because he understood it more than he expected to. He shared something too, a story about a failed early project, how he'd nearly lost everything and no one knew because he kept the company afloat with pure will and fake confidence. She didn't laugh or pity him. She just listened, really listened, and said, "That must have been lonely." The word caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being called lonely, even if he was. It was the way she said it, not as a judgment but as a truth she already accepted. There was no edge to her voice, only quiet recognition. And in that moment, he realized that she saw him. Not the title, not the press releases, not the version of himself he curated for the world, just him. Later, as they walked outside, he offered to call a car for her. She declined, saying she preferred to walk when the air was crisp. He offered to join her. She hesitated. Then said yes. They walked slowly, the city lights flickering around them, the noise softening with every step. He didn't try to touch her, didn't reach for her hand, though part of him wanted to. There was too much weight in the silence between them to break it with anything physical. They talked about loss, hers was more personal. She mentioned a divorce years ago, how it taught her more about herself than the marriage ever did. She didn't say much about him, only that he hadn't understood her need for quiet. He thought silence meant I was hiding, she said. But sometimes I just didn't want to fill space for the sake of it. Ethan nodded. Most people are terrified of silence. She looked at him then, directly, and asked, "Are you?" He didn't answer right away. He thought about all the years he had drowned his own stillness with motion, meetings, deals, travel, noise. Maybe he was terrified. Or maybe he was just beginning to understand that silence with the right person could be something entirely different. "I used to be," he said finally. "Now I think I'm just learning what it's supposed to feel like." They reached the corner where their paths split. She turned to him, the wind tugging at a strand of her hair, and said, "Thank you for dinner. It was unexpected." He smiled. "That makes two of us." She didn't ask him to call her. She didn't lean in for a kiss. She just gave him a look that lingered, one full of unspoken thoughts, and then she walked away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk in a city he thought he knew, feeling something he couldn't define. He didn't know if she'd agree to see him again. And for the first time in a very long time, he hoped. Not because he was used to winning, but because being around her made him feel like someone worth knowing, even in silence. A week passed without hearing from her. Ethan didn't call, didn't text, and neither did she. He kept telling himself that it had only been one dinner, one walk, one evening that had left a mark on him far deeper than he wanted to admit. He buried himself in work, filled every spare hour with meetings and strategy sessions, flew out to San Francisco for a conference he didn't care about just to stay moving. But the silence, which used to be a safe space he retreated into, now had an edge to it. The absence of her voice, her gaze, her steady presence was too noticeable to ignore. Something about Grace had changed the way he processed time. Days felt longer, conversations felt thinner, and even success rang hollow without someone to reflect it back with the kind of honesty she gave him. When he returned to New York, jet-lagged and irritable, he walked by the same bookstore cafe where they had once sat for hours. He paused outside, unsure why his legs had brought him there. A part of him hoped he might see her again by chance, standing at the counter with her tea, tucking her book under her arm, giving him that calm, unreadable smile. But the space was quiet, and she wasn't there. He went inside anyway and sat down with a coffee he barely tasted. For the first time in a long time, he felt unsure of what to do next. And it wasn't about strategy. It was personal. Vulnerably, uncomfortably personal. 2 more days passed. Then he received an email. Not a call. Not a message. Just a short email, written with the same clarity she used in speech. It read, "Ethan, I didn't disappear. I just needed time. Would you like to meet?" Gee. There was no timestamp, no location, just the choice left in his hands. And he didn't hesitate. He wrote back one word, yes. She chose the place, a quiet bench in Central Park just before dusk. When he arrived, she was already there, wrapped in a long coat, her hands in her lap. She looked peaceful but distant, like someone who had spent the afternoon arguing with herself in silence. "I didn't want to ghost you," she said, before he even sat down. "I just needed to clear my head before I let something start that I might not be ready for." Ethan nodded and slowly lowered himself onto the bench beside her. He didn't press. Didn't try to explain how much he'd thought about her in the past week. He waited. Grace took a breath, her eyes on the lake in front of them. "I've been alone a long time, Ethan. Not because I don't want connection. But because I stopped trusting myself to choose people who actually see me. People who stay when things get hard." "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. She looked at him then. "You say that now. But you don't really know me. Then let me." Her expression shifted. Not completely open, but not closed either. She turned back toward the lake. "I'm older than you," she said suddenly. "Not by much, maybe. But enough that the world will notice. They'll talk. They'll speculate. They'll assume. I don't care what they say. You will if you build something with me and it starts costing you." He leaned forward slightly. "Grace, I've spent my whole life building things that didn't last. Companies. Deals. Brands. I'm finally ready to build something that does." The silence between them grew longer. Not uncomfortable. Just real. A pause that meant something was shifting. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. "I didn't tell you this before. I was going to. Then I got scared." She handed it to him. Inside was a printout of a medical report. Her name at the top. A few highlighted lines near the middle. He looked at her sharply, already understanding. "Early stage," she said. "Treatable. But it's cancer. And I've been through this once before with my mother, and I know what it does to people who stay." He stared at the paper, then at her, then slowly closed the folder and placed it on the bench between them. "I'm not afraid of staying," he said. "I'm afraid of missing the chance to." Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them away with practiced grace. "I didn't expect you to say that. I didn't expect to feel any of this," he replied. "But here we are." She nodded, slowly, and after a long moment, she reached for his hand. It was the first time she touched him. No words followed. No promises. Just her fingers curling gently around his, and his grip tightening in response. And in that moment, with the sky turning amber and the world softening around them, Ethan knew something had begun that would not be undone. Ethan hadn't known what it would feel like to stand beside someone through something uncertain, something heavy, something not fixable by strategy or money. He was used to controlling outcomes, redirecting problems, throwing resources at complications until they bent to his will. But cancer didn't bend. Grace didn't bend either. She didn't want to be pitted, didn't want to be protected, and didn't need to be saved. What she needed, she told him plainly one evening, was someone who wouldn't vanish when things stopped being easy. And so he didn't. He showed up. He went with her to appointments. He sat in waiting rooms with people who didn't know who he was and didn't care. He brought her soup she didn't always eat and flowers she never asked for. He read to her when she was too tired to keep her eyes open, and when she asked him to just be quiet and sit with her, he did that too. Grace never made it romantic. She never framed it as tragic. She simply lived it, 1 hour at a time, with a strength that made Ethan feel like a child in comparison. She cried sometimes, but never in front of doctors. Only once did she cry in front of him, and it wasn't because of pain. It was because her hair had started to fall out in the shower, and she stood in the mirror and said, "I don't want to stop feeling like myself." He told her she never could. He meant it. They started staying in more. She gave up her classes temporarily, which she hated. He adjusted his work schedule around her treatments without fanfare or announcement. His team noticed, of course. Jason especially. But no one said anything. Maybe they sensed that for once, Ethan wasn't playing a part or hiding behind perfection. He was simply where he wanted to be. One night, they sat on the floor of her apartment, backs against the couch, a movie paused on the screen but forgotten. She wore a soft knit cap, her eyes clear but tired. He asked her if she was scared. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, yes. But not of dying. Of being forgotten before I go. He looked at her and said the words he hadn't yet allowed himself to speak. I love you, Grace. She closed her eyes, leaned her head against his shoulder, and whispered, then remember me always. From that night on, everything changed, not in some grand, sweeping way, but in the rhythm of their days. Ethan began keeping a journal. Not for work. For her. He wrote down things she said, things she liked, things she feared and overcame. He wanted to remember the exact curve of her handwriting on post-it notes, the way she hummed to herself when she cooked, the smell of her lavender soap. He wanted to carry her with him in every form possible, no matter what came next. Eventually, the treatments began to show results. The tumor had shrunk. Her blood work stabilized. The doctors started saying things like, encouraging and manageable. Grace didn't celebrate. She said she would believe it when the scans stayed clean for 6 months. Ethan said he believed it now, not because of numbers, but because he'd watched her fight without giving up 1 inch of who she was. Spring came early that year. One morning she opened the window of her apartment and let the breeze rush in. Her scarf fluttered, and she smiled in a way he hadn't seen in months. I feel like I might be coming back to life, she said, and he kissed her like it was the only truth he needed. That same week, she quietly returned to her teaching. Just 1 class. Just 1 afternoon. But when she walked into that room and saw her students waiting, she didn't cry. She stood tall. And Ethan, who watched from the back row without her knowing, felt something inside him realign. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was reverence. That night, she found the journal he had been writing and read 1 page before closing it gently. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over, put her hands on either side of his face, and whispered, "No one's ever held me like this, not with their hands, with their memory." And for Ethan, a man who had spent his entire adult life building a name, a company, a legacy, those words were more permanent than anything he had ever written in stone. Summer arrived with a kind of quiet gentleness neither of them expected. The air was warmer, yes, and the days were longer, but the real change was in the way Grace moved again, with more energy, more presence, the weight in her steps beginning to lift. Her hair was growing back, fine and soft, and she had stopped wearing scarves altogether, even when walking through crowded streets. Ethan noticed the way people looked at her, how she didn't shrink from their glances. There was a different kind of grace in her now, one that didn't come from performance or elegance, but from survival. She looked like a woman who had been to the edge and chosen to walk back. Ethan's world had changed too. His office now understood that his schedule belonged to him, not the other way around. He had delegated more in 6 months than he had in the past 6 years, and to his surprise, nothing fell apart. He still made decisions, still gave direction, but he no longer felt compelled to micromanage every outcome. Jason had taken on more responsibility, and in one quiet conversation over drinks, he told Ethan he was proud of him, not for the business, but for finally learning how to be a human being first. Ethan didn't reply. He just raised his glass and let the silence be enough. Grace and Ethan began spending weekends outside the city, sometimes renting small cottages near the coast, sometimes just driving with no plan. They didn't need distractions. They had become their own quiet ecosystem. She brought books, he brought his notebook, and they existed in the same space without needing to fill it with anything more than shared breath and soft music. One Saturday evening, they sat on the porch of a small wooden cabin, watching the sky melt from gold into violet. Grace had a blanket over her knees and her fingers curled around a mug of chamomile tea. Ethan was writing in his journal, not noticing that she was watching him. "Have you ever thought about what happens after this?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the peaceful stillness. He looked up. "After what?" "After we're better. After I'm better. After it's not about cancer anymore." He closed the journal and set it aside. "Every day." Grace didn't smile. She looked away, thoughtful. "I'm not sure I remember how to live without a fight." Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Then we'll learn together. No finish lines. Just, what comes next." There was something incredibly vulnerable in her silence. She didn't want to admit she was scared of peace, but he could see it. She had become so used to surviving that she didn't yet know how to thrive without it. And so, for the first time, he told her something he hadn't shared with anyone. "When I was younger," he said, "I used to think love would get in the way. That it would slow me down, dull my ambition. And then I met you, and everything stopped, but not in the way I feared. It stopped the noise. You stopped the part of me that was always running. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to stay still." She didn't cry. She didn't rush toward him. She just reached over, placed her hand on his, and nodded once. That night, she fell asleep with her head on his chest, her hand resting on the notebook he'd left open beside them. In the morning, she asked him to read her a page. He chose one written weeks before, when she was still deep in treatment, when she had said nothing for hours and he had feared she was retreating from him. The page described her presence in that silence, how even when she wasn't speaking, she was still the loudest thing in the room to him. When he finished, she kissed his cheek and said softly, "You make me feel unforgettable." Later that week, they went to a dinner party hosted by an old friend of hers. It was the first time Ethan had met many of the people from her life outside of him. Some were surprised, others quietly judgmental, and a few whispered comments about the age difference. Grace noticed, of course. But Ethan held her hand all evening and introduced himself not as the CEO of a powerful company, but as the man who was deeply, unashamedly in love with her. She didn't say anything about it on the ride home, but once inside, she stood in the middle of the kitchen and whispered, "Thank you for not letting them make me feel small." He shook his head. "You were the biggest person in the room." That night, for the first time, she asked him to stay. Not just for the night. For good. He didn't need time to think about it. He simply nodded, took her hand, and unpacked his things one by one. It didn't feel like moving in. It felt like arriving. Autumn came like a soft exhale, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was bracing for the next thing. The days grew cooler, and their lives settled into a rhythm that felt real in a way nothing before it ever had. There were no declarations, no official moments of redefining what they were to each other. They simply lived. Grace taught a few classes again, not because she had to, but because it brought her joy. Ethan began working more from home, calling into meetings from their living room, sometimes still in his t-shirt while Grace passed behind him, humming under her breath, barefoot and glowing in her quiet way. The city faded a little in their minds. Their world had become smaller and warmer and far more meaningful. On the first chilly Saturday of October, they decided to walk through Central Park, the place where so many of their unspoken truths had first surfaced. Leaves fell around them like gold confetti, and she linked her arm through his as they strolled slowly through the winding paths. They talked about small things, the books she was reading, a dish he wanted to try cooking, the color of the sky. But underneath it all, there was something heavier brewing in the silence between their words. Grace had been waiting for the results of her latest scan, and the appointment was in 2 days. Neither of them said it out loud. They didn't need to. The weight of it sat gently between their steps, acknowledged without being spoken. That evening, they made dinner together, laughing when he burned the garlic and she splashed wine all over his shirt. They played music too loud and danced in the kitchen like two people trying to outrun time. But when the plates were washed and the lights dimmed, Grace sat beside him on the couch and asked quietly, "Do you ever think this could end suddenly?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the woman he had fallen in love with, but the one who had taught him how to stand still and feel everything. Then he said, "Yes. That's why I don't waste a second of it." 2 days later, the results came back clear. No signs of progression. No evidence of disease. Grace cried in the car. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft letting go of breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan took her hand and held it all the way home. They didn't celebrate with champagne or big announcements. They sat on the couch and watched the same movie they had started and never finished months ago. She fell asleep halfway through with her head on his chest, and he didn't dare move for fear of waking her. The next morning, he wrote her a letter. He didn't give it to her right away. He left it folded on her nightstand, tucked between her book and reading glasses. In it, he wrote not just that he loved her, but that loving her had changed the structure of his soul. That before her, his life had been polished but hollow, brilliant but cold. And now, even the simplest things, making coffee, walking the dog, hearing her laugh, felt like reasons for being alive. A week later, they hosted a small dinner with just a few close friends. Ethan stood up after dessert and told a story about the first time he'd seen Grace reading on the theater steps. Grace, red-cheeked, shook her head like she was embarrassed, but she smiled the whole time. When he finished, he looked around the room and said, "I used to think power was about how many people knew your name. Now I think it's about who you become when no one's looking, and who you love when you finally let yourself be known." That night, as they cleaned up together, Grace asked, "So, what comes next?" Ethan looked at her and said, "Tomorrow. That's all I want. And the day after that, if we're lucky." He didn't propose. She didn't ask him to. There were no big gestures, just a quiet certainty between them that this was it. That what they had built, through sickness, doubt, silence, and rediscovery, was already the kind of forever people dream of but rarely get to live. And even if time wasn't guaranteed, the love they created in it was whole. Unapologetic. Unshakable.